So let's dig into what actually makes up an official client framework, one of those React and Vue applications. And there's really two pieces to it. So you have the component library and the web application at its core. There's a few more things now, but at its core, these are the two main things that you'll have to implement when you go to implement your own client framework. And we're going to talk about the component library first. And for this, I really just want you to think of the component library as just an NPM package. This is a place where you're going to store reusable components that you don't want buried inside your application. And you want to be able to share these across all the, a bunch of different applications. So that's really what goes into the component library. And the first thing you're going to implement is a Sitecore Context. So you're starting from scratch, essentially, on the client side, and you need some place to basically manage state. And I'm going to say that this was my entire Sitecore Context. It's very simple. It probably could be more complicated, but it really doesn't need to be. So it used to manage state, and some of the state fields include like route data, the current item ID that's being rendered, and any additional context that's passed from layout service. It also holds a reference to what is called the component factory mapping. And this is important because this component factory really acts as a bridge between our component library and our web application. So you should remember that we're in an NPM package essentially here, so we don't know anything really about the web application that's using us. So we want a way to really facilitate the ability to build components that exist in the web application itself. So really the component factory, it just provides a mapping between the component name and the actual concrete implementation of that component. And I have a basic example of one on the left-hand side. We're going to talk about this one a little bit, but basically I'm importing my one component. This doesn't actually live in in the component library, but it is a big part of it. But basically, I'm importing my component block from my web application, and I'm starting a dictionary essentially. And the key of this dictionary is the component name itself. The actual value is the implementation of that component. And then we're just exporting a single function called component factory. And this function accepts a component name, and it just gets returned from the dictionary if it's present inside of it. So just real quick, this is how you'd resolve a single component from the component library. So you'd first sort of extract the component factory from the Sitecore context, and then you can just call it like any other function. So I'm just passing in the content block component, and that returns the implementation of it. And I can use a built-in svelte component called svelte component, and the this prop on it accepts a implementation, and it'll create an instance of that component and ultimately render it on the page for me. And this really comes into play when you start implementing the placeholder component, because this is something you're going to have to implement yourself as well. And I have some JSON up here from layout service, which represents the JSS main placeholder that you get back. And basically, the flow for a placeholder component is that same logic we just talked about. It just uses this, it bases off this data, and we use the component name field from this data to look up components to build. So the flow is really, for each component inside the placeholder, we look up the component by name in the component factory. If it's found, we create an instance of it, and we render it. So the placeholder component is fairly straightforward, but it's just really bases off this layout service JSON. Another thing you have to implement is our field components. So field components really align with Sitecore fields. So you'll have things like rich text, images, and links. And these components are going to be imported into components you'll build in your web application to render fields, essentially. And I have an example of one. This is my entire text component. So they're pretty compact in a lot of cases. And basically how it works is, I first start by exposing some props, and these really allow the developer to pass in different, configure this component the way they want. So the field component is where you pass in the layout service data, and then we can have the developer indicate if this field could be editable or not, if we want it encoded, and then a wrapper tag around it with the actual tag, and then a class name perhaps. So, but then ultimately, the real purpose of these components is to facilitate the switching between the editable field from layout service. So if we're an experience editor and we have that field present, in the actual value field in the layout service data. So in this example, we're just checking to see if we have that field present and if editable is true. And if it is, we'll use the editable version. Otherwise, we'll just display the value of this field. And then we just render out the markup on the page. So if this is configured properly and everything is set up properly, then we just display this field on the page. So talked a lot about this component, and actually I wanted to look at the finished product of this component. So this is the entire content block component in Svelte. So in this example, we're just importing the text and rich text components that we've built out. So the text component is the component we just looked at. And we're exposing the fields prop, which allows the placeholder to pass in our layout service data for this particular component, which is on the left-hand side. And then we're just using these components. So we're passing in the layout service on the layout service data for that field on the text component. And we're also doing the same thing on the content component as well for rich text. So that's really what comprises your component library. You can put as many things as you want in there, but at its core, those are the main things you'll put in there. So just to summarize a little bit, the Sitecore Context stores layout service data and a component factory mapping. The component factory is really a bridge between the web application and the component library, and it used to resolve components by name. And then field components align with Sitecore fields, and functionality varies between them.